So we have a difficult task on our hands, one that has arguably never been perfected. Our job is to create an experience with an authenticity that can inspire real feelings indistinguishable from that which is acquired in the real world, with a video game. Fuck. This is what I used to tell myself in one point in my life, subconsciously. But the crux of what I have personally to say is that there isn't much to say, that there isn't much to be said. So the best I can do is tell you how you would accomplish this, which is that it is all a matter of how seriously you take your job. I'm not like any would-be game developer, as you may well know by now. I'm willing to consider myself the absolute best at what I do. And that is what I want to talk about first, which is that it is required to think this way. And I encourage anyone who is in a similar position to think the same. You are the best at what you do. Only you can make perfection, because only you can improve upon yourself. Only you can be better at yourself. Only you understand what it takes and what must be done. And because it's on your hands, you have a responsibility to deliver the world true grace, as it were. You are not a perfectionist. You are perfection-seeking. The perfectionist makes sure that their work is as good as the rest. Someone who seeks perfection makes sure that he or she is better than the best. Elitist values most closely depict the dedication necessary to produce change, and is the only worthy denomination capable of igniting such passion, and hence I bear it openly. I'm not afraid to appear as supremacist to my contemporaries, and furthermore, I would encourage them to do the same. I would appeal to them to welcome debate and criticism that invites people to prove them wrong. This is because the only form of quality and pride worth having is the kind that stands up to criticism and can be defended unapologetically by its own merits. Finally, if you do not take yourself seriously as the task at hand, as the role you are trying to fill, how can you expect anyone to appreciate the effort for doing so? You have to lose yourself in your work and act becoming of the person who is the best in the world. I cannot stress this enough. You have to feel obligated to go the extra mile, lest you face failure. So if anything I say appears to be arrogant or pretentious, know that I am aware of this, and I agree with you. It is purely from the standpoint necessary for a performance becoming of someone who is the best. You can view your efforts in retrospect with modesty after your work is done, not before. This brings me to my next point, the importance of the role you're in. To start, I need to build the perception that you need when you analyze other work. Understand that it's just people behind it. Really take in this fact as I state the following points. Every character, every emotion of every character, every theme in a story is designed by someone else, by somebody else. Imagine the level of understanding it takes to characterize and personify a personality that isn't theirs, that everything a character or society believes in has to be manufactured by a writer. Levels differentiated by the fact that it is one thing to thoroughly understand what you yourself as an individual believes and feels. It is another thing entirely to understand it to the level of being able to portray it and articulate it to those who are different with accuracy, so that they can say they understand you. Next, understand that you're doing this across societies and even entire civilizations of difference in terms of personality to the same level. A writer has to do this with every character they develop, and the level of understanding it requires to perform this task masterfully is astronomical, so much so that people will often jointly design characters, which I am strictly against because I believe it compromises pure idioms. Indeed, every feature of a character you find appealing is little more than a part of a writer's mind you are agreeing with. This means that a character you find strong is really another person you're admiring. A character you find sagacious is a person who's likely full of experience in their years. A character you find relatable is a person who understands your personality so well that they can duplicate it on a whim alongside various other personalities besides their own. A character you see as a role model is actually another person you are confiding in. But the irony here is that there is no secret to achieving this level of understanding that brings great quality character designs. You simply have to take it seriously. You have to imagine yourself in their position. What would you do? How would you feel? Put yourself in their shoes and really acclimate to it. Do it until it hurts if you need to. Remember, you are the one who knows what it takes. You know what you are doing. Make yourself afraid of the conflict in the story until you feel your heartbeat rise, or break yourself until you are in tears. Make it feel as if though you're ripping your own arm off. When you feel like you really have something at stake and want the story to go in your favor as the protagonist, you have effectively put yourself in the shoes of those who will read your work. Those who really want the good guy to win or the bad guy to lose. If you are seeking perfection, this is where it lays, because this is the only place where, upon reaching it, you can say, there is nowhere left to go. If empathy is real, this has to be the most effective way to attain it. You have to be the actor who, until the curtain closes, really believes you are that person. The sheer difficulty of this task alone serves to explain why many, if not all, notable writers have terrible experiences to draw from, because the ability to depict the experience is far easier if you actually have been through it. But if you haven't, you have to study and emulate the experience until it can be imitated with authenticity tantamount to what is demanded. I have put many years trying to put myself into the place of my characters, into a powerful setting that I sadistically keep teasing you with, and I still can't be certain that I've done a proper job. I'm still not certain. I'm not sure I've balanced quantity with theming appropriately. It can drive you mad, but like I said, it's all a matter of how seriously you're willing to take it. Are you willing to study another culture or master or create even another language to better grasp an expertise on a single given perspective of personality? All for the sake of authenticity that may or may not even be noticed by casuals, when empathy itself may not even be capable of being extracted from the medium you're working with for the purposes you need? There are few who are. This is why there is room to advance the medium for both consumers and designers. Once you begin to view every detail as a conscious choice, you'll begin to notice patterns and precedents more clearly. Start to analyze detail from the designer's point of view. And as you do this, you will notice just how quickly you will amass these observations that others take for granted. The ability to digest other content quickly with accuracy is a fundamental asset that will solidify your confidence in your own craft. The seriousness of this work, however, is kind of debilitating in a perspective that it kind of forces on you. And maybe this is just me, but I would be remiss if I did not mention it. I have come to respect characters in a different sense than most. You see, once you've tried to empathize with other people and characters as long as I have, you find that there is a certain delicacy to them. Characters, as it is widely accepted, are projections of who we want to be and recognize with. By simply understanding why we like and don't like ourselves, which is a natural byproduct of the aforementioned efforts, you begin to realize that it becomes trivially easy to subconsciously design characters that are essentially our negatives. They excel everywhere we do not. They have the courage or the looks or the strength that we think we lack. We are able to assemble these traits and combine them with authenticity because it is what we have spent our entire lives envisioning. It is sometimes little more than the projection of ourselves as the person we wish we could be. Likewise, the opposite can happen when a character is designed who resembles us and is thus downplayed and villainized because it may very well be how we see ourselves. And so when the job is to create conflict for characters that we ourselves view as much better people than us, the idea of our normal selves dealing with this conflict as we try to put ourselves into the shoes of our projected character can become inflated, which is why deriving authenticity is such a task. But the point I want to make here is that, in a very literal sense, we are playing God with these fictional characters who are, at their roots, much better people than you and I. They don't make mistakes, except the ones we ordain they make. They face any task without fail, no matter how arduous or how demeaning, with great solidarity, and only fail when we say they do. Who in the real world is capable of this? How can we, as the shitty people we are, compare to these virtuous souls? It really dampens the idea that these characters should be used at our disposal, and makes the reality that they are all the heavier to carry with you as an artist, and is harder still to swallow when you realize your characters will be subjected to the same treatment if they are ever viewed with popularity. Viewing these works with sanctity, or as even people, I would argue, helps to establish a sense of importance in your task. And the reason I bring it up is because it may very well help you take it more seriously, People might think it's fun to make caricatures of people's work and force them into different contexts or ship them across genders to meet their perverted narratives, but make no mistake. When fans do this, it is an affront to the integrity of the work, and no self-respecting author would ever condone this. The same is true of other forms of art as well. For instance, playing music that promotes peace and egalitarianism to the background of Hitler and Nazism is an affront to the musician. This really applies to both parties involved, really, but it's not always as black and white. Playing extreme death metal to the background of Gandhi, for instance, is kind of missing the point. These kinds of things are ridiculous and thus scarce because they misrepresent both ideologies. Comparing SpongeBob alongside Schindler's List is inherently a false equivocation, like comparing naturalism to abstract expressionism. They aren't even in the same league. The fact that this happens so much in the genre of fiction, and that it is not immediately met with ridicule, is just another reason why it is not taken seriously and remains disreputable. But in the end, only you will be able to decide when your job is done. But some universal advice that I will not abstain from advocating is that you should not rush your work. It's probably obvious coming from me that I believe it hurts in the long run, but the reason I say it is because oftentimes, when addressing the task of brainstorming or writing, and suggest a beginning to a piece of content, is sometimes just to start writing randomly. Just put something together to work with, and let your writing technique take over. I sharply disagree with this practice. Always start from inspiration. Always start from a place you wish you could say you designed. Inspiration that can be as big as an entire setting to as small as a line of dialogue or a complete scene, or perhaps a simple pair of tits. Analyze why it works and why you like it, and implement it until you master it. This is the process of taking precedents and reforming them to fit your needs. This will often result in you changing your opinion and whether you respect a certain aspect of a design or not, and thus incorporate it into your repertoire as you continue to flourish as a designer. This works across disciplines fairly well, in fact. For the most part, whether it be acting, sketching, writing, or even singing and playing. But perhaps the most beneficial aspect of designing this way is that it also teaches you what doesn't work. If you analyze what does work, you will begin to notice why it wasn't done another way. Art isn't all just about doing what you feel. You can still get things wrong. It is still very possible to do things incorrectly, and you don't get points by claiming you're being innovative or original when you're just ineffective and neglect the basics. Originality has to be made while observing the classical and ubiquitous trends. Here's an analogy to help. It is commonly understood by scientific fiction authors that our ability to improve our technology will trivialize problems in the future, and that the entirety of history is evidence of this. If you take a modern scenario, like 99% of the wealth being controlled by 1% of the population or something like that, and actually examine what 1% spread of wealth accommodates in terms of standard of living, it is much greater than it was 1,000 years ago, or even 100 years ago. 1,000 years ago, 1% of the wealth basically meant you begged on the streets until you died if you didn't have some land you inherited to farm, or were in some kind of nomadic tribe, even in modern countries. Now, 1% of the wealth in first world countries is still able to provide reasonable transportation, clean water, basic shelter, basic education, and perhaps even some form of basic health care and food. This is done through efficiency derived from technology that allows for regulations to be put in place to accommodate the 99% with mere chump change. 1,000 years ago, the ability to mass-produce food or transport any amount of goods or services in a timely manner was not technologically feasible by the state, and anywhere it was would require more than 1% of the wealth. So scientific fiction authors understand that they must write their conflict somewhere between the modern era and a time where the efficiency of technology has become so astounding that 1% of the wealth can afford a standard of living that is only marginally, if at all, different from the standard of living of those that control the majority of the wealth, if wealth at all still exists. If they don't, then there is no relatable conflict. Economics, which is the allocation of limited resources to meet unlimited needs, will be a thing of the past, and all problems, with the possible exception of religion, will follow shortly thereafter. Technology, because of its sheer effectiveness, allows for those scarce resources to essentially provide for everyone at a rate that 1% of the wealth can purchase, and then some, giving more room to allow for charity and subsidies becoming of an advanced civilization. This, as you'll surely notice, assumes that we never make it past where we are socially, and partisanship is never outgrown through enlightenment. If this efficiency is possible, then any given civilization will eventually reach this point if given enough time to exist. Of course, some civilizations will reach this goal quicker than others if they don't have to practice science through the teeth of religious dogma and other obstacles like a hazardous planet, for instance, which serves as a concurrent basis for a possible setting-based conflict, by the way. So if a writer presupposes that a race of people has huge amounts of technology but still insists that there is a compelling plot that does not address this fact, then the writer has missed the point. Finally, if we have proposed correctly that it is indeed possible to use empathy from fiction in the real world, then there are some caveats to add as a matter of course. Upon coming to the realization brought about through empathy or anecdotal evidence, I think an examination of how people make changes from those revelations in their life is necessary. In cognitive science, when putting beliefs to scrutiny as a part of deciding whether or not living by those beliefs is worth it in both the long run and short run, you will find that a lot of what we do subconsciously is assess the credibility of where the information comes from or who it comes from. The concept is then weighed against our current beliefs, like what the person in authority says or your own experiences, and the costs and benefits of ignoring new information about a belief. Some examples before continuing would be like picking a random area to park and telling yourself it's probably safe because you really need to get somewhere that you are already late to, versus being told by a police officer before parking in the same spot that it is very dangerous, or perhaps a notice on your door stating that your water is now clean, versus the distinct memory and smell of being able to light your faucet on fire because of the chemicals mixed in it. In these scenarios, you intuitively trust yourself until a more trustworthy authority says otherwise, except in the case when that authority is perceived to be disreputable or disdainful. An authority typically obtains these reputations by empirical evidence that contradicts the motivations of their alleged altruistic incentives, or at least what is perceived as evidence against their position. But as I just described, short and long-term costs and benefits can easily cloud an otherwise objectively obvious judgment call. If what someone proposes is so much of a counter to your position that it may seriously jeopardize your way of life, a natural bias will form out of self-preservation no matter how logical the evidence is put forth against your position. These biases are invisible to those not versed in stringent logical discourse or some form of habit that stipulates self-reflection, like gaming hopefully. And what is difficult about this fact, and indeed life itself, is that even if the evidence succeeds in compelling you, it makes the transition from one perspective to another no less painful, and so the incentive to live a lie can be enticing if it means you don't have to live with that embarrassment. To put that another way, upon receiving revelation, it becomes harder to adjust to it when there is more implication attached to it. Implication like having to admit you're wrong, or having to admit someone you don't like is right, can burden your beliefs unnecessarily. The kind of burden that are inherently inseparable from confrontation. When your beliefs are being challenged by someone else, the implication can very literally be as small as a smug look or a harsh tone of voice to as large as a political platform. This is why I would assert that no one ever yields their positions openly, even in formal debate. No one ever really admits they're wrong, even if they later change their position and admit they're wrong. They elect to admit this privately instead of openly, or as openly at least. This, however, can prove advantageous to our cause. The point I wish to make is in acknowledgement of these facts, is that when you are feeling empathetic, it is an admission to yourself that is completely blameless. There is no extra baggage of implication when enjoying content by yourself privately. This is how we all form our beliefs before we shove them into another person's face in a YouTube video. True empathy doesn't lie. Revelation that is inspired by your own sympathetic faculties is not shameful. Things you learn this way are very well known to circumvent the aforementioned troubles of confrontation unless you have intentionally antagonized the content externally, e.g. confirmation bias. This is an asset unique to the digestion of media and, I believe, serves as an excellent counterbalance to escapism and addictions, but only if manifested with enough precision. But also keep in mind that the real boon here is that whether or not the person's mind is changed is not the concern here. The fact that subconsciously values are being put against each other and that an internal discussion is being held to support or reject a verdict about what is important. That's what you call growth. Being an adult has a lot to do with putting your beliefs to the test. Are you really a good person, or are you only a good person up until you're faced with any kind of adversity, otherwise known as a bad person? Are you kind and charitable, or only kind until it inconveniences you, otherwise known as when it actually matters? Obviously, this is a lifelong struggle, and to repeat myself at least once more is another reason why the less implications we encumber the struggle with, the better. To conclude then, if the premises I've stated so far can be rationally assumed to be true, and the picture I've painted more or less follows without fatal discrepancy, then this is where we should be at in the coherency of things. Firstly, we have to recognize the problems inherent with the medium, of which there are several. Namely, games are more enjoyable than other media because they offer first-hand experience. Games, as a superstimuli, induce escapism and are therefore addicting. The escapist property is specifically what takes you further away from your problems. Escapism is indirectly tied to immersion by definition. Escapism is the inevitable conclusion of powerful media. Then, our solution as responsible designers who must recognize our part in the development of the medium, including both its positive and negative effects, is based on the following assumptions. Empathy is real. The level of quality required to inspire and authenticate true empathy is not impossible. First-hand experience within games can be utilized for universal relations via this empathy. A revelation without external confrontation is easier to absorb. With this information, particularly if empathy is real and not just egoism as it is often described in moral philosophy, I think there is sufficient grounds to believe that a case can be made for the beneficial aspects of gaming being able to, at the very least, serve as an answer to the very noticeable problems of the medium, and at the very most, serve as the single greatest instrument for people in first world countries to someday truly understand one another and not be held back by the fallaciously narrowing prerequisite of first-hand experience of which we can never hope to share universally. This is the heart of my ambitions, and hopefully, if not now, then in the near future, every series designer's heart as well. And once again, I'll end it on a note I originally did not intend to from the outset. I had a friend who, more recently than I care to remember, killed himself. He was what any person who did not know he was dead would probably say without thinking twice, that he was a loser. He was 22, he still lived with his parents, who were rich as far as I could tell, never held a job longer than a few months, couldn't drive, couldn't date, was probably a virgin, etc., etc. I learned at his funeral that his older sibling used to abuse him. He used escapism in games on a daily basis to run away from his problems, and eventually he was trapped by that addiction. Before he knew it, he was 22 and had lost so much of his life. As I look over the message he sent me the night he killed himself, I realized that he was confiding in me to alleviate some of his burden. Another friend of mine, who happens to be my co-author, suffers tremendously from PTSD. He is often simply beside himself with the numbness of the memories of watching several of his friends die and having to carry them, sometimes in pieces, and try to save their lives as their medic. He used escapism with games alongside drugs and therapy, and since he got back, is only able to contribute minimally. The obvious point I'm making here is that escapism, like any real drug, no matter how good it feels, ultimately does not solve your problems. And as difficult as it is to believe, try to understand that I am not biased toward escapism or games that cause them, though I am willing to admit, just as I have stated, that my biases may still be invisible to me. But regardless, I'm still trying to address the problem of people walking away with nothing from something that can truly inspire. I believe that as a designer, the solution to bad games, like bad science, is not less games and less science. It is better games and better science. I believe as a designer, it is my responsibility to recognize that my content may eventually be all that holds someone together. Even if I think those odds are low, I have no choice but to assume they will be, and treat it like it's a matter of life and death if I have to. And I know I'm not the only one who is this serious about the medium of gaming and the genre of fiction, and is willing to sacrifice everything to see perfection done. What I want to say is that you don't have to suffer in silence. I know you're out there. I understand. I empathize as best I can.